Alrighty, in section 11, we're going to focus on the alignment of purchase orders with those demand signals, but based on this very important concept of the cascade effect, how the purchase order serves as this genesis document from which all subsequent tactical activities and documents are generated. Because the purchase order really is the pivot document, that genesis document that we mentioned a moment ago, within any import program, information born of the PO cascades down the entire inbound supply chain. We place a PO on a vendor. We pay a portion of the purchase amount up front. The supplier goes out and gets raw materials, goes into production. Cumulative lead time clock is ticking. Production is finished. Goods are delivered to a freight forwarder at origin as either a full container, perhaps an LCL shipment, less than container load shipment, air freight shipment. Goods are moved, international transportation takes place, customs is cleared in the United States. That's what we mean by this cascade effect. Second bullet, this cascade effect has already been demonstrated by calling out the documents that are born of the PO. We've been through this already. The commercial invoice, the packing list, both of which come from the vendor. The forwarder's cargo receipt, which we'll see a lot of when we get into the international transportation module. But as the name would indicate, it's the receipt issued by a forwarder at origin when less than container load goods are tendered to the forwarder by the vendor. More on that much ahead. Importer security filing 10+2, ocean bill of lading, customs entry. Basically, all of the documents that accompany the activities that were alluded to just a moment ago. That's what the cascade effect does. And that's why it's important, in part, to have reference numbers that can be intermatched across all of these documents. Last bullet on this slide, in order for those demand signals to be converted into purchase orders, certain capabilities must be in place. Sometimes they're manual capabilities. Ideally, they're digital capabilities. Either way, they have to get done. Otherwise, the supply chain will be out of sync. For an importer making purchases of finished goods from overseas suppliers on that build-to-order basis, there are several must-haves that should be in place. We'll repeat, can be manual, it's better off to be digital. So first, how do we convert those demand signals into purchase orders? Even if we only work off of a sales forecast and never update forecasts with actual demand, we still have to have a way to convert quantities in the sales forecast into purchase orders. How are we going to do that? Spreadsheets? Maybe. Digital capability? Probably a little better idea. Second, we must have the ability to assign quantities and timing of PO placement with demand requirements. This is where the manual approach becomes super cumbersome, the level of which is driven by the number of vendors we work with, the number of POs we place, and the quantities in which we buy. But if we have a forecast, we're going to spread the quantities that need to be purchased across the periods in a year, which again are referred to as a time bucket, typically 1 week periods. But it's not like we're going to buy the same quantity of each product every week due to seasonality, as we spoke of, known promotions that we're going to have throughout the year, back to school being a good idea, Valentine's Day if we're in the flower business, for example, things like that. The quantities are going to change. The timing must also be accounted for. Broken record alert here. Everything we're talking about deals with quantities and timing, as it relates to POs placed on vendors to meet demand. Last sub-bullet on this slide, we need a means to communicate purchase orders to overseas vendors. Maybe it's a fax, maybe it's an email, maybe we use EDI, maybe we work off of a web-based trading platform, SaaS-based model, software as a service, where we can send POs electronically out to the trading platform, and on a permission-only basis, vendors can go into the same platform and download those POs and consequently acknowledge those POs. That's a different conversation, manual versus digital. Either way, we need a means to get that done. Moving along with the cascade effect and these must-haves that should be in place, it's a little bit more difficult to do, admittedly, but to have visibility or at least updates into the supplier's production capacity and manufacturing planning and control activities would be very helpful. We as the importer need assurances that our goods are being made in the quantities and the timing that we requested, bearing in mind that it's not very likely we're the only customer of that overseas vendor. It really comes down to where are we in line in terms of the master production schedule, or as we see in our second sub-bullet point, visibility into the progress, actual production of PO-specific items. If we have a 120-day cumulative lead time on a product, we don't want to find out on day 100 that the goods haven't gone into production yet. We need a method, a means through which to gain that visibility. Last sub-bullet point here, also the ability to track new purchase orders as well as cancel or increase/decrease quantities on an existing PO. This has to do with not only forecasting, but those actual demand signals that tell us, hey, this product's selling way better than we thought it would, or hey, this product isn't selling very well at all. How do we make adjustments between the sell side of the supply chain and the buy side? We want to track new POs that we're placing on vendors, but if we have to make adjustments on existing POs, we need a methodology to say, hey, it's 2 weeks before the cancellation date on a given purchase order. Our sales are telling us that we're not doing so well with this product. Let's cancel that PO. Or maybe we've had historical quality issues with a vendor. We have an outstanding PO that needs to be canceled because we've replaced that vendor with another, as long as it's before the cancellation date. And then where it becomes really tricky from a timing perspective, because lead times can be 90 days, 120 days, even longer in an international supply chain. How do we make PO changes without blowing up the master production schedule of the vendor, without creating major problems with that vendor? We increase a PO that blows up their production capacity. We decrease a PO when the vendor already went out and bought all of the raw materials for the first PO. The timing of those cancellations and or changes are super important. We need an ability to track what's going on with new POs as well as those changes to existing POs. Some more must-haves that should be considered. A capability for vendors to make PO and item-level ocean freight bookings with carriers and or forwarders. Now we're moving down that supply chain. Goods have been produced. They still have to be transported. In today's world, there are electronic capabilities out there that allow vendors to make bookings for an ocean container or containers electronically. That electronic booking, as opposed to an old-fashioned telephone call, creates visibility. Usually, as a general rule, importers like their vendors to make a booking 15 days in advance of the desired ship date, so the steamship line can plan for the loading of their vessels. Doesn't have to be 15 days, but that's kind of an industry standard, certainly coming out of Asia. But moving out of that production environment into a shipping environment, it's very nice for vendors to make both PO and item-level ocean freight bookings with carriers and or forwarders. Emphasis on PO and item level. Why is that? So we know what is coming in the specific ocean containers. More on that later on. As goods move, we also want to achieve purchase order and item level visibility into ocean containers at every point in the maritime logistics chain. In-gate at a terminal in South Korea. Actual shipping of the containers, whereabouts of those containers on the water, arrival at a port terminal in the United States, visibility milestones across the maritime supply chain, but not just on a container level, not just on an ocean bill of lading level. We need to know what's in those containers so importers can in turn begin planning for how to distribute the contents of those containers once they get to the United States. PO and item level visibility in today's day and age, pretty much a must. Last point on this slide, we also need the ability to align PO information off of the purchase order with those subsequent documents that we've talked about so many times, with the vendor's commercial documents. The commercial invoice, the packing list, etc. For what? For purposes of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, compliance, and ultimately, customs clearance. Classic example of the cascade effects of goods physically moving across the supply chain, but accompanied by easily identifiable and trackable documents that drive downstream activities. In this instance, in the end, customs compliance and U.S. customs clearance. Last slide on this section. Here's one that sometimes importers don't think about, an automated mechanism that translates commercial and transport documentation into those customs entries we just spoke about. Great example of the cascade effect. We get quoted from an overseas vendor. We negotiate with that vendor. We come to an agreement. We place a purchase order. Goods go into production. They're ready to go. Commercial invoice, forwarder's cargo receipt, packing list, maybe a certificate of origin. It all depends on the nature of the transaction. What we're saying here is an electronic capability to repurpose all of that information into a customs entry so customs brokers aren't sitting there rekeying information that already exists somewhere upstream in the supply chain. Repurposing information. That's what we're talking about here. As goods arrive to the U.S., clear customs, we are deciding as the importer what to do with that merchandise. Where to send it, to what DC, to what warehouse in the United States. So we want the ability to transmit container, shipping, and domestic distribution instructions to an in-house or third-party transload operation. That's a mouthful. We're going to get into things like transload and buyer's consolidation when we get into the logistics module. But for now, transload, usually done by third parties, it's a warehouse in close proximity to a U.S. port where ocean containers, once cleared through customs, are drayed to, the contents are stripped from that container, and based on, ideally, electronic instructions sent by the importer, that third party can take the contents of those ocean containers, put them into different domestic truck trailers, and ship them to various destinations, as defined, as assigned by the importer. Again, a lot more on transload later on, but visibility on that and the ability to transmit those container stripping instructions for domestic distribution, really important. And then once that stripping takes place, transload takes place, the physical movement of the domestic shipment by truck, by intermodal, or even by air freight can be tracked. This is what we're talking about in an import supply chain and the impact and importance of the cascade effect, all of which starts with that pivot document, that Genesis document, the purchase order. We'll talk more and more about this as we proceed. That's it for section 11. When we come back, we're going to continue to build upon this whole idea of the cascade effect when we get into methods for determining product quantities and the timing of purchase orders. We shall see you shortly.